Here I am with Kristie Monteiro. Kristie, thank you for taking some time to be together to talk about this important topic.
Thanks, Mark. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm encouraged to be with you today.
Yeah. Everyone knows Kristie, I think. She, of course, is the mission director for Disciple Makers for Life. And I thought she would be the perfect person to interview about how do we best support and develop and empower movement leaders, because she's someone I experience as having a movement leader heart and experience. She's a missionary kid. She's led cities. She's led all kinds of movement kind of ministry. And yet she sits in a very high organizational role. And so I thought she'd be a great person for us to kind of wrestle through. So just to kick things off a bit here, Kristie, is when you think about movement leaders, when we think about that, I'm thinking about apostles, I'm thinking about pioneers, entrepreneurial type leaders. What are some of their common struggles that you've found that they have?
Yeah, well, I think there are many, but I think a lot of them a lot of them feel isolated. I am really interested. Oftentimes I'll hear somebody say, "Well, even in our navigator context, well, I'm a navigator, but not that kind of navigator," or they have a lot of kind of well, I don't do like normal navigator thing. I'm doing this alternative thing. So there's a lot of prefacing sometimes in their talk, and I
Mhm.
think a lot of it comes from feeling like I'm the only one thinking the way that I'm thinking, and no one else is thinking this way. And so there can be this kind of isolating feeling where you sit in meetings and you feel like, okay, that sort of speaks to what I'm doing, but not all the way. And I think that when you do that consistently, you feel that isolation in a really real way. And the second thing is, I would say, is a lot of movement leaders feel misunderstood. So often movement leaders currently, they're doing this thing and they're doing this activity, or they're participating in this way of ministry
Mhm.
because they think that will eventually lead to this other goal. But oftentimes they're kind of in this flex space where what they're doing doesn't seem like it translates to maybe the real product we produce as disciple makers. Maybe you're starting a business and you believe it'll lead to disciple makers, but it's not quite at that point yet. And so there's this sense constantly of feeling misunderstood. Like what I'm doing is constantly misunderstood and is not validated as real or in pursuit of. And yet the intensity with which a movement leader feels like they're pursuing the advance of the gospel of the kingdom
Mhm.
is probably at a heightened level than everyone else in the room. And yet they feel like no one perceives that in them, and they can feel really misunderstood. And then you also feel out of control. You're leading from this place into the movement with people that you have no authority over, like no structural authority over. You know, a person you invested in may decide to go use their giftedness in the local church community, and you feel disappointed that they're not joining you among the lost where you really hoped they would plant themselves. So there can be this sense of just out of controlledness that we struggle with. And then another thing is, I think movement leaders are focused on responding to what's happening immediately in front of them. And so sometimes they aren't thinking as broad or as in longevity or in depth. And so they can respond to decisions being made in the organization or other places like as kind of out of touch, because they're really dealing inside this, focusing on the now and what's happening right now.
Mhm.
And so I think that's one of those things. And then, really, another thing that I feel like they struggle with, the spiritual battle when you are pursuing the advance of the gospel in the kingdom is really real. And it manifests itself in your family, in your relationships, in stupid things like plumbing and electricity in your house. And, 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 when we don't acknowledge the spiritual battle going on behind the physical things that you're doing in mission and ministry, I think that it can be it can be a frustrating experience when we don't acknowledge, and when you don't have leaders helping you fight the spiritual side of the battle in the spiritual ways that we need to be doing that. So I
Mhm.
think those are just kind of some of Yeah, some of the struggles I've faced as a movement leader, and that
Mhm.
I do definitely see others facing. Those would kind of be some common ones.
Yeah. Thanks, Kristie. That perspective is so helpful, and your background really informs that. Now that you sit in a pretty strongly organizational footing and role, what are you learning about how to equip, to empower, and to encourage these movement leaders, knowing what you do know about them?
Yeah, well, one of them is probably I really focus on creating an environment for leaders that I actually I like to phrase it where failure is experienced as a grace. That when we fail, there's a grace in that the Lord is teaching me something about me. He's teaching me something about the movement. He's teaching me something that is going to lead me to that thing that'll unlock the gospel being unleashed in this network of people that I'm investing in. And so I just think I always am I'm always seeking about how do I create culture where failure and experimenting and failing forward is a really positive experience for people, and actually an expected outcome. Like it's expected, it's even desired and sought, because that will teach us and help us iterate forward into the things that God really does want to teach us about the movement of the gospel.
Mm.
And then, I mean, I think movement leaders, they want to be seen. I actually fall back on the LDC model, our care, the four operational aspects are, to know, connect, provide, protect. And I think every movement leader, more than any other leader, all leaders, all people need these things, but movement leaders in particular can appear like they don't need them, but they need to be known. They need to be connected to the larger whole, understanding their piece in the bigger whole. They need to be provided for, and they need to be protected. And I actually think protection is one of the major gifts, ways that we can empower leaders, is by telling them, I have your back. I'm going to take responsibility for you, with you. And that's also part of creating that culture of failure being a positive experience. And so, helping them know that they're being seen. The other thing is really letting them take risks and taking risks big with
Hmm.
them. So
Hmm.
I mean, I could tell you several stories of big risks I took, big money I spent on risks that I didn't know when I made those decisions whether they would result in fruitfulness of the gospel. But here, 5, 10 years out, I can see the ripple effect. And now it's like a no-brainer that I spent that money or I spent that energy on that thing. And I think too, another thing is to recognize you are, as a leader empowering movement leaders, you are calling out what already is. They've had a calling from God. They've had a vision and a dream, and you're really helping to catalyze that and moving them forward. And you're affirming their place in the larger work. And so the other big thing I would say for me has been learning as a leader, as an organization leader, to focus on helping movement leaders with their thing. And my experience has been that when I help them with their thing, eventually they will help me with my thing. But I earn the right to be helped myself by first helping and serving them. And I think, again, it's a principle inside our LDC model of shepherd and servant leadership above all those other things. And so I think when we help them with the dream God's given them, and I think that's one thing, organizational leaders recognizing that their role is to play the supportive, that structural scaffolding piece to the movement. I think we get further with the movement, which is really the goal.
Hmm. When you think about the differences between these movement leaders and organization leaders, and I've heard you say other times that organization is temporary. And how does that play into this issue and this tension that we're talking about with movement leaders? Is there any tension there, or yeah?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of tension there. And I think Usually when there's tension, I always believe there's kind of fears on both sides. And, Satan has his way of crafting the fears so that they become in opposition to each other. I fear what you're going to withdraw, and you fear what I'm going to withdraw. And so when I think of us building, with scaffolding this movement, the organization needs to keep shifting to respond to things. And, we might be laying a foundation. So we've got wood planks dug into the ground, and we pour that cement for the permanent structure. And then we come to remove the wood. And sometimes the permanent structure, the people working on, well, I don't know. Is it really set? Did it dry? Did we give it enough time? Is it too soon to move the wood? And I mean, in reality, they're questioning, did I lay a solid foundation of the gospel in this place or not? I'm not sure. Can we withdraw these things or not? And there's fear around that. And so I think, and then also recognizing, sometimes you're putting these wood planks into the ground and laying the foundations. Other times, our organization needs to build high scaffolding so that we make sure that the integrity of the top of the wall and the bricks being laid on a high level of the wall have the same integrity as the bricks laid at the bottom where we could reach them. And so recognizing that the organizational roles are often looking at a bigger breadth, a deeper depth, and a longer longevity than the movement leaders. But organizational leaders have to recognize, but movement leaders are looking at this slab of concrete right now and asking, is this slab of concrete, set up right? Has this row of bricks been laid right? And be able to communicate between those two sides so that we're taking that temporary structure down at times where, sure, it might be a little risky, but we know we've done the job that we came to do together. So there is that communication piece.
Yes.
Becomes really important, but some of it is being able to recognize your own fears that you're tackling in the middle of that relationship. And working together and ultimately serving what God has designed for us to build together.
Well, Kristie, thank you so much for the time. This has been really inspiring and encouraging for me. I did want to give you the last word, and thinking about this issue of how do we really support, encourage, empower movement leaders. Why is this important for us as navigators?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is the tension in between this. So I think, tension is only bad when you decide that tension is bad and no tension is good. But I think I see lots of organizations do this. And I think, for me, the yin yang symbol shows it. It's not about perfect balance. It's about knowing what needs to tip the balance of the scales. And when I think about the navigators, I think that, probably 20 years ago, we were really out of balance with not having an organization that supported the type of movement we were doing. And I think we made a lot of course corrections on the organizational side of our organization. But I would say that we've been increasingly gaining some health inside of that. But in order to do that, we did give in the movement area a fair amount. And I think we've been recognizing, especially over the last 7 years, I would say we've been recognizing that we need to really amp up the movement part of our work into a more central focus right now. So I just think we're at a key point in navigator history and culture where at this moment, God is asking us to switch the density of those things so that we can really see us leaning into advancing the gospel of Jesus and his kingdom. And so I think it's an exciting time to be in this conversation. And I also think we still need both kinds of leaders. And we also need to gain increasing prowess about how we relate to one another so that the communication between what needs to slide and how we keep this thing going forward with the purposes of advancing the gospel central to what both sides of the work are doing. So I think it's a pretty exciting time to be here and be doing what we're doing. So
It really is.
Thanks, Mark.
So thank you so much for your time, Kristie. I'll see you next time.